Hi, this is a demonstration of a landscape, and I will begin by toning the canvas immediately before I start painting so that I can erase through it with mineral spirits. I'm going to show a little bit of value. The reason that we tone the canvas is so that on white you can see that it looks pretty dark, this Naples yellow, and on the canvas itself, on the tone, a lot lighter. So our values are definitely according to what it's in relationship to, and you need to start with a tone so that you can see things against a mid-tone instead of against white. Now in this case I've got a lot of light things with some dark behind, so I'm actually gonna change my usual procedure and start by erasing out some of the white shapes. Again, looking at big shapes. If most of that tree is lighter than middle value, then I'm going to put the shape in as I see it. So just not thinking tree, not thinking anything, just thinking, what is the shape? How long is it? How wide is it? How deep is it? Seeing, at the same time I'm looking at the shape, I'm trying to see what's behind the shape. So I see negative shape, positive shape, and that's a word that I'm going to use a whole lot of times. I do believe that shape is probably the most common word I use in the English language. Shadow shape, light shape, dark shape, negative shape, positive shape. It's all, if we can quit identifying what we see, if we can quit putting a name on it, it gets our expectation and our memory and our intention, what we kind of think we know, what we remember, out of the equation. So now after erasing, I can also put value back in. I'm still aware that I don't have the right shape on the top of this. They're a little bit better. So just seeing what I can do about from large to small shapes. Now I'm working on a little bit smaller shapes, and always trying to see where things are in terms of sometimes a plumb line that I'll throw down, and if I put something down vertically, where does the window lie in terms of a vertical plumb line from the peak of the roof. Just trying to evaluate. I'm looking at the white shape now. And then I'll come back and look at the dark shapes separately and then see which one looks the best, comes closest to what I see. Another kind of a middle value, not too much lighter than what we see. The sky is pretty dark on this. A nice bright sky. I've speeded this up a little bit. That's why I'm doing a voiceover, because otherwise my voice would sound like a chipmunk. But it takes a little bit longer for me to actually make a demonstration, and I seem to think that it's a little bit harder to do it as a video, so I want to not keep you for 2 or 2.5 hours. I want to keep it a little bit shorter. So I've divided these videos into 3 parts. Part 1 is this block in, and then I'll do a second video, part 2, and a third in the finish stage. I am still not happy with the angle of that roof line. I don't know if I'll fix it later. As I see this and as you see this, I realize that watching a demo the audience is probably saying, wait a minute, that's wrong. And that's how I am now. I'm seeing the video proceed and saying, I'm not seeing something quite right in the actual angle of the left side of the top of the roof. But now I'm going to start putting in some darker shapes. And of course that tends to be a negative shape. And I'm still using a rag. I've come to believe, for me, that it's just a little bit easier to block things in a big shape way by using a blue auto rag. Doesn't work so much with a paper towel. These auto rags, they are cloth, but they're cloth that's almost like material, actually even better than cotton. And they don't crumble, they don't shed, they don't lint, and they hold up. So as I'm doing it, I can also control the amount of mineral spirits that I put on. I'm thinning a little bit with mineral spirits, but if I use too much of the solvent, it's hard to layer one layer on top of another. So I want to be very dry about my layers, and that way it sets rather quickly. But my biggest consideration is larger shapes, darker shapes first. And not getting into any small fussy shapes until they have their turn. Large shapes, middle shapes, next smallest shapes. It's all in terms of size. If you keep that formula going, it'll keep you out of trouble, because the big shapes have the most power, and once they're put in correctly, then everything else just follows along. So it's just something to remember, that we get tempted to put in like little marks around rocks or little indications of wood trim on a doorway or on a window, and then we end up building the window or the door like a carpenter would build it, and that's not our job. We are supposed to paint light and shadow. That's kind of important. We are artists, and we are describing light and shadow and color, warmth and coolness. We are not really trying to copy what is in front of us. We are trying to describe the sunlight and the color and the temperature and the emotion that we feel. And that right there is why a photographic rendering is not our goal. It's kind of fun, and it certainly amazes people when we can just copy something right down to the most minute rendering. But copying a photograph to the nth degree is amazing, but doesn't have any sense of feeling or our own sense of wonder about it. It's just amazing, but dead. Our job, as we get more skill, and by that I mean the time it takes for us to be able to see correctly and render what we see, after we get the basics down, the ability to draw the shape and put the value correctly and put the light shape and the dark shape. Once we do that, then we start actually becoming a little bit more concerned about how we feel about something, why we're painting it. I definitely think we should paint only the places that we have been and have experienced, rather than copying calendars or magazine pictures. It's again part of that. We have a feeling or an emotion, and that's important. Otherwise, it's just taking what somebody else has done and in a photograph and trying to make it our own. It lacks something. But if we all copied a photograph perfectly, they would all be exactly the same. And I don't think that's really what we're aiming to do. So eventually, after you get your skill set down, you want to be able to express some atmosphere, some color, some interest, some texture, some things that are quite advanced, and usually that means that you're making fewer mistakes and you're more efficient about how you're making your marks. So what most people call loose painting, I call skill and efficiency, because loose painting kind of implies not very accurate or approximate, putting something down just to kind of get a mark down. I've heard that so many times. I'm just putting something down to make a note. Well, I'm trying, as I get a little bit further in my experience, I'm trying to put something down correctly so that I don't have to go back and change it. The more that a painter can put something down and leave it alone, that's real success. That's what we're all aiming for, is like a John Singer Sargent feeling that there were about 3 strokes that were perfect, and those 3 strokes tell the whole story of what's happening. That's a good place to aim for. I did have some knowledge that a little bit more recently, that in doing those 3 strokes, there are stories that he scraped them off about 50 or 60 times before he was satisfied with those 3 perfect strokes. So it's not that you don't ever, it doesn't ever get easy. It's always a challenge. And I guess that's why I like this whole deal. I like the fact that we never get it completely right. We never get so good that it's easy. We never get so that it's just a piece of cake. It's always a challenge, and it's always that we're going to get better, and it's always that we're going to probably discard about 3 out of 10, and we're going to think about another few out of 10, and we might frame 3 out of 10. And I find that proportion, that number, doesn't really change. You would think someone would keep almost all of their paintings after a certain point, but in fact, that does not happen. We seem to move the goalpost, and pretty soon it just seems like we're still just as critical as we are in the beginning. So you see me putting a little plumb line down, seeing if I can see where things are, adjusting the roof line just a little bit from the negative to the positive, and now just continuing to mix some dark values. I'm much more interested in what the value of something is, and pretty much maybe whether it's warm or cool. How dark, how light, how warm, how cool. It's not going to ever be possible to match every color. It just isn't. The amount of colors that we see with our eyes are hundreds of times more than what we can make with paint. So I'm more interested in getting as close as I can to the value, and I might even push color a little bit, warm and cool. It's, again, an emotional statement, and you'll see me sometimes putting the brush up to what my reference is, and sometimes that helps me see if I've got the correct value, and sometimes even if it matches pretty well in color. But I'm not gonna expect that I'm gonna match every color exactly, especially since the photograph itself is not correct to what I was seeing when I was out there. So that's kind of a false point, trying to match exactly. It's mostly just what is the shape, what is the value, how dark, how light, and how warm and how cool is it. I'm making a tone for anything that's not exactly white. Whole areas not completely white, so I want to make sure I'm aware of anything that has a tone. This area a little bit cooler, that whole area. I'm not thinking about branches or trunks, I'm thinking about areas of shadow inside the magnolia that's just about ready to pop, about ready to bloom. Every level of darkness, every shape that goes a little bit darker can bring forth a shape that was put down before in a middle value, and then as the dark areas go, they identify and reveal things that are middle value, so that so much is described by painting around something, what the shape of the shadow is behind something. And pretty soon things get revealed. These are dark shapes on a white building, but I'll be adjusting pretty soon because they don't need to be quite as dark as black. The things dark against white are usually not quite as dark as they seem, so you'll notice later I'll be adjusting that a little bit. I'm thinking about design here. Pretty soon I'm going to decide that perhaps that bush next to the clothesline is leaving a fairly even space between the bush and the house. And I'm going to be considering whether or not that's almost like a halo around the house, which would be a distracting shape, so I'm going to probably consider getting that changed. but mostly just taking each shape and making it a little bit more specific. Here I'm worried about edges and silhouettes, making sure it doesn't look just like round lumps or bumps. I want every silhouette to be interesting. And now I'm thinking in terms of just what I was before with the tops of the small white bush. I don't know if that's another magnolia or what, but what I'm thinking is surface and side. If the surface is catching light, it will be much lighter. And the side of things will be darker. So we've got light coming from the sky. The source of light is the sky, and anything that's on the surface is going to be lighter than most things that are the side. The exception, of course, is if the sun is coming from a lower angle, which in this case it is, and so we've got pretty much direct sunlight on the front of the building as well. So that's another surface. Now I'm mixing a color. I think we're going to go into the sky itself a little bit, which is what I think I'd say value at least 5, maybe even 6 towards the top. So trying to figure out exactly what's going to look good. And since it's a little tiny mark, it's hard to judge. So I'm going to get a little bit more of the cerulean blue and take it from there. This is a surprise how dark the sky is against the white building. Now I moved the reference so it was not quite in front of the painting quite as much, hoping that you can see a little bit more of what I'm doing. Still just developing the sky. I'm using a small palette so that you can see a little bit of my mixing on a vertical plane. So I'm a little tight for what I usually have for space. But it's nice to be able to see the mixing as it goes. I think my colors are pretty much from light to dark, from warm to cool. I have yellow ochre underneath the white in the corner. I have a Naples yellow and then a cad yellow light, cad yellow medium. We have cadmium red light. And then I think I have, let's see, looks like burnt sienna. Then I have a magenta, permanent magenta. Then I have a violet gray, cerulean, and then let's see, chromium oxide green, and then another green, I think it's a sap green, ultramarine blue, and let's see, phthalo green, I think, in the corner. And then I also have black, ivory black. This is going to have to get brightened up a little bit, but right now I'm looking again for the value as much as possible, and a little bit of a transition from darker at the top into lighter as you come down into the horizon line. Trying to do some sky holes. And now seeing where else that same value might be reflected in the windows, might be echoed around. That same color value can be bounced around the painting a little bit, so I'm usually going to see how I can find other places to put the same color and then darken it a little bit, and it's still got the same blue inside of it, but it's now being used as a way to put some cool in. A bit of an adjustment, go a little bit more green. I guess one of the comments that people have made to me when they watch my demonstration is that they notice that I'm using a fairly light touch a lot of times, and I'm changing my brush a little bit sometimes, but most of the time I'll use the same brush for a good deal. I've got a paper towel in my hand. I can wipe off a good part of the paint quite often, but lots of times it's just how much pressure you put on the brush. You have things inside of the brush that if you press hard, it will reveal, and if you go softly and lightly, it'll just give you that color that you just put on at the very surface. So sometimes it's just a matter of what brush time, experience. You get used to these things, and there's no other way to get there. You just have to put in some time. But a light touch is really helpful. And you'll see me quite often make a test mark and see if it's correct, and then I'll adjust it, darker, lighter. See what needs to be done, but first you just put it down in the area that you're looking at and then see how close it is and make an adjustment. It's very rarely correct the first time. Shape darker at the bottom. If there's anything I guess I could say, it would be I'm leaving edges to the last. I don't need to clean up every edge. I see a couple of them that I'm working on a little bit, but the majority of edges, window edges, door edges, that's almost like a final process. I'm going to be looking at mostly the interior shapes. And then, of course, as always, the negative shapes. Nice little dark in here. I think what I forgot to say, that's a King's blue light next to the white and in between the white and the Naples. It's basically a very, very light cobalt. Don't forget I'm working from dark to light, so I'm thinking in terms of putting the light on top. I'm sure you've noticed that I'm not dealing with tree trunks or branches at this point. I'm looking for the form of the tree where the light does not come through, where the sky is not visible, where it's solid tree against where the sky holes come in. If you start putting tree trunks first, it's almost always going to be a symbolic tree trunk, and I want to see the shape of the foliage more than the branches, and then the branches are in between what you've put down for foliage shapes. That looking for the shadow areas, what's lighter, what's darker, what's surface, what's side. Repeat, repeat, repeat the same value somewhere else. And how light is what I'm looking at? How light is it compared to not just what it's next to, in fact, not what it's next to. How light is it against the lightest thing in the painting? That's what I'm concerned about. If you look at just the immediate area, you're going to be a little bit misled, because something might look really light in a dark area, but it's not as light as the lightest thing in the painting. That particular physical fact is well described in John Carlson's book of landscape painting. And so I'm going to wrap up the beginning video. This is mostly the block in finished, and I have almost every part of the painting covered with an approximate and close value to what it'll end up being. The next video will take it a little bit further, and the final video is on a finish, and I hope you enjoy what I'm presenting, and I thank you.